Okay, I don't think I mentioned it on the first video here, but I do want to point out I am not necessarily going to go through all of the slides from each chapter. I'm just going to pick the ones that I feel like are most important to talk about. And so from here on out, you are going to need to depend a little bit more on your textbook in terms of picking up the additional material. Make sure you're reading your chapters now that we're not having long classes together where people can ask questions really easily. Um, it's all still fair game for the exam, so please be doing as much of this work on your own as you can. And then, of course, please do use these videos as useful material too, is what I'm hoping, right? Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to talk about from Chapter 10 is what makes the difference in terms of whether or not kids do well in school, adolescents, whether or not they do well in school. The research that has been done points to some factors that are probably going to be unsurprising ones to you. One of the biggest factors, continuing on through adolescence, even though it's the biggest factor during childhood, family environment continues to be one of the primary factors that is going to be correlated with whether or not kids do well in school. So if you've got mom and dad paying good attention and sort of being on top of your stuff and going to parent-teacher conferences and knowing what your grades are and knowing who your friends are and where you're spending your nights, that is increases the likelihood that you're going to do well in school. As much as I hated having my mom come to my parent-teacher conferences, because I always lied to her and told her I was doing really well in my classes, even when I wasn't, because I was apparently pretty stupid. Not realizing that I would get in more trouble when she came back from that meeting when I'd been like, yeah, everything's fine, go ahead, mom. And then she comes back and she's like, not fine, what's wrong with you? I don't know, I wasn't the brightest. Nevertheless, even though I hated that, it kept me working on my material and helped me get caught up when I got behind, so that I was able to maintain a decent grade point average and not have to drop out of school and some of these other negative outcomes that are more likely when mom and dad aren't involved. This goes back to the conversation about parenting styles, Baumrine's parenting styles that we talked about in a previous chapter back before the midterm, right? Remember that authoritative parenting, where there are high levels of warmth and support, but also high levels of control, uh, that is the style that tends to work out best, not just for kids being happy and having friends and all of that, but also in terms of whether or not they do well in school. And so the general outcomes that I gave you for those different parenting styles hold true for academic outcomes as well, where kids with authoritative parents do best. Following in second place are authoritarian parents, although much like with other outcomes at large, kids do tend to rebel more when they reach their later teens in authoritarian scenarios and may see their grades drop accordingly. But once again, having some level of influence and control from the parents, even if there's not as much warmth, is still going to work out better than outcomes are likely to be in terms of grades for kids of either permissive parents or certainly for kids of neglectful parents, right? Socioeconomic status also matters, right? A lot of this has to do with expectations. Where do you live? What kind of neighborhood do you live in? How much wealth is there in that neighborhood? Um, is going to shape a person's expectation, a teen's expectations of academic achievement, right? And not in every single scenario. There are plenty of folks who have risen up out of very poor and very difficult living circumstances growing up and have achieved at the highest levels. So I don't want to say that's impossible. I do want to recognize, though, that that is the exception. If you grow up in an environment where school is treated as an afterthought or as um, a babysitter for kids rather than a place for you to begin your career and start your development as an adult, then you're less likely to pay attention to it. You're more likely to be involved in delinquent behavior. And so you do see this pretty strong correlation between higher levels of SES and higher levels of achievement in academics. The expectations are simply going to be higher in those homes, from those parents, from the neighborhood around you. Uh, and if you're growing up in a really tough neighborhood, even if mom's like, no, you got to be going to school, you got to be going to school. If none of your friends are all that fussed about school, and none of their parents are all that fussed about school, and nobody that you know is headed off to college, then the likelihood that you will do so is lower as well, right? Is this fair? Is it right? No. Nevertheless, it is the way that our society seems to work. That sort of ties in with friends and peers. You're going to make friends and peers around yourself, so that's going to tie in pretty closely to your SES, your socioeconomic status. And the more engaged and involved your friends and peers are academically, the more likely you are to achieve academically as well. Issues of work and leisure. Think back to that 2 Million Minutes documentary that hopefully you watched a little bit of. I'm not sure if the excerpt that I got there gets to the issue of work. That may be later in the documentary. But U.S. teens are expected to engage in money-making work once they hit, 15, 16, 17 years old, in a way that perhaps is not quite as strong an expectation in other cultures. And that means you're going to have to split your time between your part-time job and your academics. So I know in high school, I worked at KFC for like 3 years, all the way through high school. I gained like 40 pounds because I'd get a free plate of chicken and whatever anytime I went in, and I put that to good use or bad use, I'm not sure which. But I was always gone, right? I managed to keep up decently with my studies, but between my extracurricular stuff with plays and choir and whatever else, and then going off to work probably 15 or 20 hours a week and being an assistant manager there, I certainly was not paying as much attention to my academic success as I would have had I not had that job, right? And so, yeah, how much you're working, what kinds of leisure activities you are involved in, that's going to have some say in how you do in school as well. Now, in terms of the leisure activities, that goes again back to the friends and peers issue, right? How do the people that you spend time with and spend your leisure time with, how do they feel about academics? Are they folks who get all their homework done first and then go and have fun? Or are they just like, whatever, I'll get to it? And once again, the environment around you is going to strongly influence how seriously you are likely to take your studies, right? And then this is going to differ from culture to culture, and that's something you saw in the video as well, where one particular culture is going to put more pressure or less pressure, depending on where you're at, in terms of how much you are expected to achieve academically. I don't believe the end of the documentary is there, but it's really interesting. That doc, although it's interesting and I like it, it has some problems that I don't love. You've got these uber high performing Indian and Chinese kids compared to top 20% American kids, right? And so it feels like, and again, I may be totally wrong about this. I don't know very well the spectrum of academics in either of those other two countries, but it felt like you had top 1 or 2% academic performers picked from the Chinese and Indian kids, and then top 20% picked for the American kids, and there's going to necessarily be a difference there. And not only that, but then the outcomes that they talk about in terms of whether or not these kids achieve their academic goals. It talks about the American kids achieving their goals and getting what they want, and the Chinese and Indian students not. But the goals are not necessarily equal, right? So, like, the Chinese young man is trying to get into the top mathematics program in the top Chinese university and feels like he fails at the end of the documentary, because even though he gets into the top university, he doesn't get into the top maths program. And so he's disappointed with himself, right? Likewise, the Indian girl wants to go to some, I believe it's an engineering school that is described by Bill Gates as the best engineering school in the entire world. And she doesn't get in, and she has to go to her second choice. But then the American kids, they get into their top choices, but their top choices are like Penn State. No, I'm not knocking Penn State. I'm sure it's a decent university, but it's not the best engineering school in the world. It's not the top mathematics program in China. And so, the weighting of success versus failure feels a little uneven there. Once again, this is going to have to do with how we frame things culturally. Is only the top outcomes, are those the only acceptable outcomes for you, or is there a broader range of outcomes that are available to you within your society? Okay, now there are going to be some differences, other differences that are correlated with academic performance. You do see ethnic differences, and you're probably aware of those stereotypes here in the United States. The expectation that Asian American kids are going to perform super well, that African American kids are going to perform more poorly than average, and that white kids are supposed to be somewhere in the middle, right? Now, I do want to call out specifically um, and address these ethnic differences. Some of this can be explained in terms of cultural backgrounds. We talk about U.S. culture versus Chinese culture versus Indian culture, but in reality, United States culture is diverse, and where you live, where you come from, not just regionally, but even down to sort of the neighborhood level, is going to influence um, you in terms of your academic achievement, like we've talked about before. And so there can be some cultural influence in terms of how seriously kids are taking their work, their academic work. Um, but I want to, hopefully this is not news to anybody, but I just want to make sure I squash the idea that there might be any sort of biological differences that underpin these ethnic differences in academic performance. The research the most reliable and high quality research that I have read and looked at suggests that when you take into account level of resources and level of SES, your socioeconomic background, once you factor those differences out, the differences between ethnicities in terms of academic performance disappear. So it's not that Asian American kids are actually academically smarter than anybody else. It's not that African American kids are academically any worse off biologically or in their minds. It has to do with how many resources you were afforded as a group on average across the United States. And unfortunately, a lot of our ethnic minorities, especially African American folks, they grow up in poorer neighborhoods that don't have as many resources in their schools, and as a result, don't get the chance to achieve or the opportunities to achieve in the same way that some other groups might. Once again, on average, there's going to be, I have no doubt there are hundreds, if not thousands, of African American kids that could just totally destroy me in any academic field you care to think of. But that does help us understand why you do see some of these differences ethnically within the United States. Girls tend to be better in terms of their academic performance than boys do. Once again, this has a lot to do with socialization. How much responsibility do we expect kids to take as they are growing up for their own upkeep and performance, and responsibility for their own lives, and we tend to do a slightly better job of that with women than we do with boys at this point in our history. You tend to see higher levels of expectations for girls and from girls in terms of what they want their academic outcomes to be. They're less likely to drop out of school. They're much more likely to graduate from college. I think something like 60% of all undergraduate degrees here in the United States go to women at this point. And interestingly, they are also less likely to be diagnosed with learning disorders, which is going to have some impact on how well kids do in school, obviously, right? Um, Now, once again, we're talking on average. Plenty of super smart dudes out there, not saying otherwise. But when you're looking at groups overall, you do see these differences.